Hello, all. Welcome to episode 4 of the Phoenix Cast. My name is Em Alves. I'm the Violence Prevention Education Coordinator. And today's episode is Why Doesn't Esty Leave? So today we're going to be talking about the episode, the miniseries Unorthodox. And joining me today is Megan Cullen, who I will let introduce herself.
Hi, y'all. Megan Cullen. I'm the director of the Phoenix Center. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I am here both as a person who loved Unorthodox and as a PCA staff member and also a Jewish person.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. And my pronouns are they, them, theirs. I just want to thank Megan again for joining us. If you recall, Megan was here for episode 1. So thank you again for coming back.
Yeah, this is awesome. I love doing this.
Yeah. So Unorthodox was definitely a series that was recommended to us. So this was a series that someone mentioned in actually a division meeting here at the Auraria campus, virtually, of course, with everything going on. And we looked at it and we were like, wow, this is an amazing tale. It's based on a memoir. And the main character, Esty, is based on the memoirist Deborah, who we'll get into a little bit of her story at the end of the episode. But we're focusing on kind of like the fictionalized version of her life. And Megan, as Megan mentioned, is a Jewish person. And so is going to be providing some of that cultural background that the average non-Jewish person may not have. So in that vein, Megan, would you kind of want to provide a little bit of that setup and kind of going through like, you know, what's Orthodox? What's ultra Orthodox? Is there a spectrum of Orthodoxy?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. So the first thing that I'll say, I am by no means a Jewish scholar. I am a Jewish person. I identify with a conservaform Judaism, which is a mix of conservative and reform Judaism. These are different kinds of sects if you think about them. And there's sort of reform, well, Reconstructionist actually is is the most permissive and it's the most open. So Reconstructionist services, to my understanding, I have not been to one, so I don't know, are in a lot of English and things like that. Reform, there's more Hebrew. This is how I think about it. Reform, there's more Hebrew. Conservative, there's more Hebrew. And Orthodox, it's like all Hebrew. And then ultra Orthodox, it's all Hebrew or Yiddish, which are neither languages that I speak or anything that, you know, I think most Americanized, secularized folks who identify as Jewish do, right? We learn to read Hebrew insofar as we can follow along in the prayer book and read the Torah for our bar bat mitzvah, but we don't speak it. Like that's not something that we learn. So what's important here when we're thinking about Unorthodox, which, like you said, is based on the memoir by Deborah Feldman, we're looking at ultra Orthodoxy, right? Ultra Orthodoxy is super restrictive. It is based on really isolation, right? So the idea of ultra Orthodoxy, and I'm going to get into, there's a couple of different sects there too, but the idea of ultra Orthodoxy is that what is written in the Torah and the Talmud and the rabbinic teachings, which are written based on those two things, are law. Like that is it, right? And they are law as written, not like law to be interpreted. What you'll find in the less Orthodox, more conservative, reform, Reconstructionists, like those pieces, are a lot more interest and willingness to take what is written and interpret. And interpret for modern day, interpret for what works for a particular community or a particular person.
So kind of treating it more like a living text rather than like, this is static, we are going to follow it word for word. It's more understanding like this was written in a time and we're no longer in that time. So what still works?
Yeah, and I think that reform and conservative Judaism, from my experience, are much more about like the spirit of the law than the letter of the law. if you want to think about it in that way, right? What is the meaning of this law? What were they going for, so to speak? And then how do we take that essence and apply it to the world we live in now? Because the world we live in now and the world in which the Torah was written are vastly different. Whereas in Orthodox sects, it's very much more like, nope, it says that you don't like engage with any kind of work on the Sabbath, and you don't. That is it. You don't do it. So like, that's where you see situations where you have what they call a Shabbos goy. So that's a person who is non-Jewish who comes in at Shabbat and will turn on the lights and turn off the lights because there's it has been interpreted that using electricity is a kind of work, and all of that type of thing, right? Within ultra-Orthodoxy, there are a couple of different sects. There's the Haredi, and within Haredi, there's there's more, but there's two major sects within the Haredi. One is the Satmar, and this is all about what rabbi do they follow. Right.
And Satmar is the community that Deborah Feldman is from, correct?
Yes. And ergo Esty from the show.
Right.
And then you have the Hasidim, right? The Hasidim are another type of ultra-Orthodox. What really separates them, and then I will stop. What really separates them is the Hasidim are more willing to engage with the secular world as a way to help Jews be more observant. That is their ultimate aim, by my understanding and my experience. And the Haredi are just like, no, we're not engaging with the secular world at all. In fact, you're not allowed to engage with the secular world at all, with the exception of like, you see a secular person walking down the street, like, you don't have to go apologize for that. Or you have to engage with them through a business venture. Okay. But that's the big difference between the two. But yeah, so Deborah, or Esty in the show, is part of the Satmar sect.
Okay. And can I ask, is this just scratching the surface of the different sects?
Oh yeah. Most definitely. I mean, we could do like 6 different podcasts.
Okay.
I'll say this very quickly. There is a sort of a Jewish proverb, if you will. You ask 3 Jews a question, you get 4 answers. That's basically what it is.
Okay. Okay, so that makes sense. Yeah, because it does seem even within the show, it does seem like there's like degrees, right? And so it gets a little confusing and within the show and within the memoir. So I mean, the level of control that Esty experiences in her ultra-Orthodox Satmar community is, so what I'm hearing and what you're saying is that that's not necessarily uncommon within the community, is that you don't really have a secular life. Your religious life and your secular life are intertwined. They're not actually separate.
There is no secular life. Your life is religious, right? Like, so your entire life is governed by the Torah and is governed by what your community expects of you based on the Torah, and what your rabbi expects of you.
Right. So not very individual.
No, there's really not a value, particularly, here's the interesting thing, right? There's a serious gender divide, right? So there's not a lot of tolerance for individual thought, period. There is even less tolerance for individual thought from a woman, right? And I use the binary term woman very specifically because there is also a complete kibosh on anything that is not gender binary.
Right. So, I know that in having conversations about this show, something we talked a lot about is like, at what point does a religion become a cult, and what does that even look like when it's a larger religion that then has very separate sects? And then at what point is it a sect versus a cult? And can you like unentangle those two?
I can try.
Of course, there's no, like, to our listeners, there's no really clear answer, right? Like, these are really complicated discussions that Megan and I have been having. Like, we really appreciated the show Unorthodox for the specific tale of Esty, for Esty's specific journey towards freedom and towards leaving a situation that was specifically harmful for her. And so it's been complicated, and we're not saying we have the right answer. We're just saying that this is a conversation that we want to have and we think is important to have.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that framing quite a bit, right? Because we don't have a right to say what is good and what is not. And so in trying to even discuss that question, you know, I was trying to find like, what is the academic definition of a cult? You know, there isn't one.
Oh, really? There's no academic one?
There isn't one that I could find.
Okay.
So what I found, and please, listeners, if anyone happens to be a cult expert and has one for me or us, we will take it. What I found was that, and I'm pulling it back up, was that the term cult has actually been sort of co-opted by the general lexicon and is actually quite frowned upon by sociologists. Right. So sociologists are actually using the term new religious movement. Right. And when I started looking into that, I was like, okay, well, that's not really what I'm looking at, what I'm looking for. So what I did end up finding is I end up finding an article actually on Lifehacker, believe it or not, where they did an interview with Paul Morantz, who is a cult expert. Right. And he talks a little bit about like, what are the pieces of what we would consider like a dangerous cult, right? We're thinking about things like Jonestown, right? To go all the way out to the end of the extreme, right? When I'm thinking, and what I was thinking about was like, when we're asking the question, is this a religion or a cult? What I ultimately came down to is this a religion or is this a dangerous interpretation of a religion, right? And how do we make that, distinction? And what I came to was his points, right? And some of his points were like, look at who's in charge, right? Is there one like central figure that people hold or that holds themselves with like a level of grandiosity and that people hold them to a level of grandiosity? Do they claim to have special powers? Yeah. Are they particularly charismatic? I think the first two pieces are particularly important when we're thinking about this particular experience, right? An ultra-Orthodox sect like the Satmar follow a rabbi, right? Follow the Rebbe, which is a little different, but it's basically the same thing. Follow a Rebbe who is like the person. They are the leader. And insofar as like, in fact, like there are dynasties, right? Like, so the Satmar Rebbe, his son, then became the Satmar Rebbe. Like there isn't an election process. There isn't an application process. There's just a dynasty, right? And then also like looking for signs of brainwashing, right? And brainwashing, he talks a little bit about like, look for isolation, look for peer pressure, look for control. And that's all things that we see evident in Esty's story, right? She's hyper controlled every moment of her day, really, or not every moment of her day, but every aspect of her life is highly controlled, very isolationist, right? So she's not allowed to go anywhere that's secular or be seen with secular people. The fact that she takes piano lessons from a secular person is like, don't want to talk about that. And then the peer pressure piece too, right? Like, and this is where I think you and I were talking about the term systemic abuse, right? That there is systemic violence that is then enacted by every single member of that community because every single member of that community is buying into the ideas that are making it keep going.
And I think that's really key, right? A religion with, can you repeat what you said about like the religion with
a dangerous interpretation of a religion?
With a dangerous, yes, because I really do like that, because the last thing I ever want in having these conversations is for anyone to hear this and hear us saying that religion isn't valid or that this particular religion isn't valid. And that's something that I'm personally a religious person, so that would be against my own beliefs. And then as well, like we also know that religion can be really healing for a lot of people. But again, for Esty, it was not. And it was like Esty's exposure to that systemic abuse and individual abuse that we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important distinction there too, to talk about the fact that what was harmful to Esty was the community and the community's interpretation of the religion, not the religion itself, right? Like if we're just thinking back to like the source material being Deborah Feldman, she still identifies as Jewish. She just doesn't identify as Satmar, right? So it isn't the religion that's the issue. It's the interpretation, and then what is enacted to support that interpretation that is at issue. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That, I think that makes sense to me. Awesome.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good jumping off point to kind of talk about Esty's story. So Esty, the first episode we talked about yesterday being like really uncomfortable, right? Like you start off with Esty like basically mid-flight. You have this like anxiety that you can't really place. I think that the editors and the storytellers, the directors, they did a fantastic job with really putting you in that like very nervous mindset. So you sort of see Esty carry out her safety plan without the realization that it is a safety plan until later on in the flashbacks. Let's talk about that safety plan. You mentioned the piano teacher. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship with the piano teacher?
Yeah, so it looks like, you know, from everything that we've seen, that Esty, you know, was able to engage with this piano teacher at a fairly young age, and was able to continue to engage with her. And she was really her window to the outside world, right? Like she was her window to what could be. Right. And it seems like from what we see in episode 1 and informed by the rest of the episodes, is that, you know, she had this idea, and the only person in her entire world that she could maybe go to for help was her piano teacher, because her piano teacher was the only person she knew and had any connection with who wasn't part of her religious community. You know, so I think they came up with this plan together. And you see too, and I think it's really powerful. I think it's in episode 2, not 1, but when the piano teacher stands up to Esty's father and uncle. And I can only imagine how powerful that must have been for Esty to be sitting there like subjugated because she's a girl, right? And then you have this woman who's not religious, who is a goy, who is shameful just by that very fact, right? Standing up with righteousness to say like, no, this isn't okay. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I believe I recall that scene.
Yeah, when they like come for the rent.
Yes.
Whatever. Yeah. I can only imagine how powerful that was for Esty. And I can only think that probably informed her, like feeling like this person was trustworthy and was able to help her.
Right, because she provided an example of something she didn't think was possible.
Exactly, right. And then you have the piece of the repatriation paperwork.
Right, yes. And I thought that was so interesting, right? Like Esty's mother brings her on the eve of her wedding, brings her the repatriation paperwork to Germany. Esty's family are Jews of German descent. And so after the war, after the events of the Holocaust, they were granted the right and the paperwork to repatriate Germany as a part of reparations, if I am correct.
I believe so, yes.
Yes. And so her mother, though she has been exiled from the Satmar community, though she is treated as if she is dead, comes back from Berlin to the United States to make sure that Esty has this paperwork on the eve of her wedding, because she knows what marriage looks like within the Satmar community, because of how she similarly fled the community. And so the piano teacher ends up safeguarding that paperwork and making sure that paperwork is able to be filed and that she is able to have a safe address to receive her German passport. And so another thing that I thought was really, really important about the piano teacher is that the piano teacher, there are these little moments, I believe, throughout that you sort of see her kind of suggest, like, you know, it doesn't have to be this way, like, you leave. But at no point did that piano teacher push Esty to leave before she was ready. And I really want to highlight that, because that's something that so often we see for people who don't do the kind of work that we do around interpersonal violence. People don't know or don't understand that when a survivor is leaving a situation of violence, that no matter what type of violence they're experiencing, that is the most unsafe time in their life.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And I know that, Megan, both you and I have seen the harms that is done by a well-meaning person who is trying to push someone to leave before they're ready to do so, or before it's safe to do so.
I think what's really powerful about that too, right, is I think that people don't necessarily understand how what an abuser, a perpetrator, a person who causes harm, right, is saying that they're unintentionally mirroring, right? And what I mean by that is like often in situations where there is abuse happening, the person who's enacting the harm is saying things like, people don't understand us. People don't understand where we come from or who we are or what we're doing, and they can't understand, so they really can't weigh in, right? And then you get a person who comes in and enacts that, right, like that doesn't understand that how dangerous it is to leave or what really is at stake, and they say, well, just leave, and that then like backs up the harming person's whole like, they don't understand us, because then you're like, well, no, they don't, like, then who does? And it just breeds that isolation.
Absolutely. And something that a professor of mine used to say, an old mentor at my undergraduate institution, was whenever someone says just do anything, you always have to notice that they're asking you to do something incredibly difficult. Whenever it's like, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just not be depressed? Like, it's always followed by something that's actually far more complicated.
Yes. I love that. Just don't be depressed. Oh, thank you. You've cured me.
Why did I think of that?
Exactly.
And it's also that it's an insult to your intelligence too. Yes. Right? It's like, oh my God, did you think I really didn't think about that?
Well, and it's not that simple, right? And then like when you're pushing someone to do something that they're not ready for, you make the divide between you and that person even bigger. Absolutely. Because then they don't feel comfortable coming to you, whether because they think that you disagree with them, or they're just like, well, they don't understand and it's going to take me too much time to explain.
Absolutely. I always, whenever I think folks ask me like, what is the best way to support survivors? It's always just be there. It's never telling someone what to do. Because when you tell someone what to do, it also just enacts that same power and control that they're already experiencing in their relationship or in their workplace or at home, right? Like, and also let's talk about the way that abuse permeates many spaces.
Oh, absolutely.
Because that's another thing, like, that Esty was very intentional about when she left, right? Because there is no separate world for her, right? Like, her world is very close-knit. And so you pointed this out, actually, and I thought this was an excellent point if you kind of want to just take that.
Oh, yeah, sure. The whole Shabbat thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you think about the fact that like every aspect of Esty's life is controlled, she has to think about, when is she going to have a minute, right? When are people not maybe paying attention to her so that she can get out, right? So in the very beginning of this episode, you see her packing up, and she packs up in a shopping bag, right? Because she knows people are going to see her, and this might be like a rational reason to go out. And then she gets to her vestibule of her building, and she finds out that the Eruv, which is basically it's a wire that creates an extension of the home for the purposes of Shabbat and the rules around Shabbat. That's the very basic, like, easy part, right? It's broken and no one's going to fix it, which is why all of those people are standing around in her apartment building. So she has to go back upstairs and put all of her stuff down, because you're not allowed to carry anything on Shabbat, and leave with nothing, it seems, right? Because she just has that envelope stuffed in her waistband. But she picks this very, very intentionally. On Shabbat, her husband is going to be in shul, right? Shul being temple services. He's going to be gone until lunchtime, and the plan is to meet him at her in-laws' house for Shabbat lunch, right? So she has a pretty solid amount of time. We're talking like 3 to 4 hours where he's otherwise occupied, and she can get out. And it also means that, like, perhaps the efforts that are taken to get her back are going to be delayed.
Right.
Because can't get in a car on Shabbat, can't use a phone. Like, all of these things have to wait until Shabbat is over.
Right. So it buys her that lead time.
Yep.
Yeah, I thought that was really, really smart and something that I actually didn't notice. And actually, I didn't notice the bag thing. So that's really, really helpful of like how she adapts her safety plan to fit the needs and the constraints of the society that she's living in.
Like how strong of her to like her plan was screwed, right? Now she can leave with nothing and she still goes.
Yeah, right. Because for her, especially when we later on see why, or kind of why we believe she left, you know, that takes a lot of strength, because later on in episode 2, I believe, it's revealed that Esty is pregnant. And leaving your everything you know is hard enough. Leaving everything you know with literally nothing but the clothes on your back, and a passport and some paperwork, and being pregnant.
Can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's unimaginable. You're fleeing like country line, like international lines. He goes to a different continent.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking this is like so not what she was worried about, right? But she gets off the plane in Berlin and I'm just like, how did she do that whole thing without a book? I'm just like, it's so not important. But I remember, I think we actually find out about her pregnancy like towards the end of episode 1. Okay. And I remember when we found out, my immediate thought was, oh shit. Oh no. Oh, that's so bad. Oh God, that's so bad. And I know you had the same thought, right? Why were you thinking that?
Like in what way do you mean? Like, why was I thinking about
like how the pregnancy complicates
absolutely
like the whole situation?
Yeah. So another thing that we know, another one of the most dangerous times in a survivor's life is during pregnancy. For many perpetrators, and for many abusers, and we'll get into, I think, in the next episode about whether or not Yanky is good or bad, and the very complicated narrative around that. But what we know about abusers and perpetrators is that ultimately, pregnancy is the most dangerous time in a survivor's life, because you feel that you are losing control.
You being the perpetrator.
Yes, perpetrators feel that they are losing control, and they are trying desperately to regain that control. And oftentimes what happens there is a really significant escalation. And that's why you also see a lot of overlap in mortality and pregnancy. So the mortality of a victim who is attempting to leave, and whether or not they were also pregnant. There is, I don't have the exact stats, but there is an unfortunately large percentage of those mortalities are pregnant folks.
Yeah. And I think like we see that play out as well, or it could have played out based on the environment that we see in the show, on a systemic level. Like, I don't think that Yanky himself would have begun enacting further harm against her because of the pregnancy. The system of the community enacts further harm on her because of the pregnancy, right? And by that, I mean, like, they enact greater levels of control.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And then, like, and we see this, and I think this is something, this may need to be our last point. But I think it's really important to mention, particularly in this episode, even though we're going to keep unpacking over the course of a couple more, is that one of the things I didn't mention in the beginning is the ever presence in the Jewish community as a whole of the Holocaust, right? So the Holocaust being the systemic genocide of 13 million people in Europe, 6 million Jews, right? The entirety of the way that the Haredi community is made up at this point is a trauma response, in fact, to the communal experience of the trauma of the Holocaust. And so, and you even see this like all the way down to when I grew up, like, I was very aware of the Holocaust and the 6 million, as you should be. We should be very aware. But there was, even at like my level, so to speak, which I can only imagine what it's like at their level, this sense of it's our responsibility as modern Jews to replace these 6 million people who were slaughtered. And the Haredi have taken that on as like their only goal. And that entire burden is placed on the childbearing people, the women in the community, to have children and have a lot of them. Right. So when I found out that Esty was pregnant in the first episode, on top of what you just said, which is all absolutely correct, I was just like, oh no, they don't care about Esty, right? And her as an individual. They care about the fact that she's taking a child with her, right? Which is like one of the replacing 6 million, so to speak. And you're also, you know, they're also concerned about bringing down another Holocaust upon them, right? And I think we hear this, I want to say like explicitly in the 3rd episode, but it shows up earlier. The idea that the reason the Holocaust happened was because of secularization. And so the only way to make sure the Holocaust never happens again is to fully embrace the kind of Judaism that the Haredi are, you know, engaging in. And so Esty leaving is like, if you want to think about it this way, like another mark in the direction of like the Holocaust could happen again.
So it's seen as a community-wide threat.
Oh yeah.
And I think that what was really interesting about that is that at one point, Esty says, God expected too much of me. Which I thought was really interesting. And to your point, right? Like that the level of control in a community exerted on a pregnant person in a community where childbirth and adding to a population is so revered is absolutely different. So the concern is usually, and not always, less physical violence and more of like, you're going to be heavily monitored. Your decisions are not your own. And if you're not having children, you're useless.
Yeah, and we see that show up perfectly in episode 2, which we're going to talk about next week.
Yes.
Right?
Awesome. So I think that's the perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Megan, for joining us for the first part of our discussion, where we kind of really tackle the ever-present question when it comes to interpersonal violence and relationship violence in general. The question that we get asked the most is, why doesn't Esty just leave? And hopefully after listening to this episode, you've come to understand a little bit more about why it's never that simple, and why oftentimes when we're asking survivors to follow our well-intentioned or not advice, we're not fully considering what's at risk for them. And so we need to center survivors when it comes to how they want to move forward in their lives. And on that note, please know that the Phoenix Center remains open through remote operations at the Auraria campus. So you can reach us at 303-556-2255, as always, 24/7, even when campus is closed. And you can set an appointment through there, or just immediately talk to someone if you are experiencing a tough time, or if someone you know is experiencing a tough time related to interpersonal violence. Thank you all so much, and don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review.
Tune in next week as we discuss Yanky, villain or victim.